So yeah, my name is Sahana, and I am going to be presenting on research I did for my master's, which I completed last year. And the goal of this research was to better understand the factors influencing the well-being of racialized international graduate students, and ultimately to identify gaps and barriers to produce recommendations for universities on where they can better promote well-being. So I'd like to start off with a land acknowledgement. So this research did take place in Canada, specifically in Lekwungen-speaking territory on Vancouver Island. So this is the ancestral home of the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanich peoples. And on the right there, I have a picture of blue kamas, which is a very culturally significant plant due to its value as a food source and trade item. So, I mean, land acknowledgements are very common practice, but I still want to incorporate this and talk a little bit about the kind of complexities of doing research with international students in a place like Canada, where the sovereignty of so-called Canada is irreconcilable with Indigenous sovereignty, and this affects the relationships, the experiences, and relations to space that international students develop as new migrants into these spaces and within institutions that are created and directed by colonialism. So also a little bit about me in terms of my positionality, why I was interested in this research, and how I engaged with this topic. So I'm not technically considered an international student during my postgraduate experience, which took place in Canada, as I hold a Canadian passport. However, I was born outside of Canada and I grew up in 3 different regions of Asia. So I did experience many similarities to the experiences of international students, and personally also felt quite unsupported, I guess, during my time within academia. In terms of dealing with the Eurocentric white hegemonic course content, teachings, and forms of sociocultural engagement. As well, I developed my strongest relationships with other racialized international students, and really wanted to honor them in terms of the work that I am doing. So I will preface this by saying I conducted this research before a lot of the mess that's taking place in Canada in terms of placing caps on international student enrollments. There's a lot of ongoing financial crises, dealing with budgets, cuts. There's a lot happening within the Canadian context right now, but I think it still holds very true that international students are a significant financial contributor to these institutions and also a source of labor within Canada in terms of building capitalist growth, and has also highlighted the value of building intercultural skills for domestic students. So those 3 things are the primary components of the internationalization framework that is used by the Canadian government and also by many universities within Canada. So my research used 2 primary frameworks, the first one being critical race theory. Of course, not every international student in Canada is racialized, but for many of them, there is a very significant process of coming to North America. They undergo the process of racialization based on ethnic, cultural, religious, and linguistic characteristics. So I wanted to acknowledge the importance of race in affecting people's experiences, even within education institutions that value diversity and inclusivity, and importance of hearing these marginalized perspectives from people directly in terms of what their experiences are and not relying on dominant narratives. As well, I wanted to use a decolonial framework to critique the structures of power that were implemented under colonialism and remain facets of our everyday lives through hegemonic whiteness. And this is very, very evident often through educational institutions, as these narratives position international students largely as racialized consumers of education rather than knowledge holders. So part of my research process was really only engaging with international students and not trying to build a balanced narrative in the sense that I think we are very aware of the perspective of the university through their governance, documents, communications, and so on, but we are really ignoring the voices of the people who are having these experiences and potentially facing barriers to their well-being. So I will just very briefly talk about how I collected the data. So I did semi-structured interviews with 22 participants. I just did one round of recruitment and it worked out very nicely, the distribution. So having 8 PhD students, 16 doing their masters, 5 had obtained permanent residency. So technically they could be considered not an international student anymore, but they were when they started their program. 10 identified as women, 10 as men, 2 as non-binary, had representation from 16 countries and 17 programs. So I was prepared to keep everybody who participated very anonymous, but I was a little bit, well, maybe not surprised, but I want to highlight how important that was for this process. Nearly all of the participants really wanted to emphasize that they felt very vulnerable in sharing experiences, particularly experiences with their supervisors or classmates or other things that they perceived as being negative for themselves, but potentially could have repercussions socially or academically. So everyone had a pseudonym, and most people did choose to use a rather Western name that removed culturally identifiable traits. Some people also asked to use different pronouns than they personally use in their day-to-day life, really to further obscure their identity. So yeah, this identity data became a bit more metadata that was just for me during the analytic stage, because I really had to be very careful and respect people's feelings of vulnerability. And yeah, so I did a thematic analysis and will share the 4 main themes that came from that. So my framework for well-being comes from these 4 themes. So these kind of summarize the different areas and sub-themes that contribute to international racialized graduate students' well-being. So the first one is political economic determinants. So this is looking at the journey to becoming an international student, which is influenced by broad political and economic factors operating at national and international scales. So for example, looking at the reasons why people are choosing to come to Canada, and then as well their lived experiences there, particularly related to financial security. And their experience as a migrant as well. So secondly is academic institutional conditions. So this is looking at all aspects of the university or educational environment. So building upon students' desires to obtain knowledge within a Western or Eurocentric institution. And this shapes the interactions between the institutional actors and the receivers of that knowledge. So this covers not only the classroom, but also the pedagogy and interactions with staff members of the university. Thirdly is sociocultural influences. So these are the factors that mark the racialized bodies and cultural attributes of migrants as inferior to those within Western hegemony. And this often relies on very simple binary paradigms, even within, so like stereotyping and marginalization, even within a country or institution that performs narratives of open acceptance, of diversity. And then, of course, personal and individual factors are also relevant to well-being. So this could include things like mental health, physical health, and spirituality. So I'm not really going to explain this, but I'm going to put it up here and I can refer back to it at the end if anyone has questions. But this is kind of the map of the main themes and the sub-themes. So as well through the analysis, I identified 7 very common barriers to well-being. But of course, not everybody had negative experiences within these areas, but that was very important to be able to compare and contrast these experiences and identify what are protective factors, what are lessons that we can learn essentially to be able to implement improvements to services or implement new initiatives to be able to close that gap between different people's experiences. So example for student-supervisor relationships, I was able to get very detailed information on what made a good supervisor versus for people who had more of a fear-based relationship. However, I don't want to just say that everything was negative. International students do enact a lot of their own agency to be able to use formal and informal strategies to promote their own well-being. So some of these are due to an absence of services and others are more in addition to. So for example, many people talked about aiming to maintain a balanced lifestyle, including intentionally taking care of their physical self, making time for hobbies, socializing, and just sort of enhancing the other aspects of their life outside of school. But there was, of course, variation based on people's gender identities, spiritual preferences, and so on, although I was not able to incorporate all of that analysis into writing. My findings also really emphasize that social connections was one of the most important protective factors for well-being. Each participant had different networks in terms of family and friends back home, new relationships they'd made in the city they were now living, partners that had migrated with them, etc. But yeah, these relationships were probably one of the most important, particularly ethnic networks, so groups of students with shared cultural or ethnic backgrounds, which not only provided more like, say, mental health benefits, but also access to material resources, including housing. Social networks had also an added benefit of increasing awareness of institutional resources and community resources that students might be looking for. So kind of closing that outreach gap. And I generally found that participants were very willing to reach out and try different services. So there was not hesitation around using mental health resources, for example, but sometimes they were not able to meet the needs of the international students, suggesting that there's some unique considerations there that the institution needs to be more aware of. So lastly, I will provide a little overview of the recommendations that came out of this well-being framework, the barriers, and also international students' own thoughts around what needs to be improved. So this is broken down into 4 themes, each with 3 calls to action. And within each call, there is a couple of points. So I ended up with 48 recommendations. So it's rather comprehensive and of course designed for this one specific institution, but I do think there are a lot that could be applied more broadly, including to other student groups. So the first theme, affordability and access to education, is mainly looking at financial barriers that limit students' access to engage within the academic community due to the increased stress, chronic stress that they face due to financial precarity. Secondly, improved academic and work dynamics aims to help students more successfully navigate academics, work, and community relationships on campus. Meaningful inclusion in the campus community aims to ensure that students are able to get appropriate information, including awareness of resources and services, also improving education around anti-racist decolonial practices and building social connections. And lastly, enhancing student service provision. So this is more related to the quality of services and level of care that's being provided. So if there are gaps within student experiences and staff training. So hopefully that all made sense. I mean, it is kind of a broad overview because each of these are very detailed, but I wanted to leave time to have a discussion or answer questions that people have. Thank you.